We have come so far. This is Revelation 20, part 13. In this next section, I'm going to explore what church history has to tell us about Revelation 20, and in particular, the views and understanding concerning the first resurrection and the millennium. Are these things literal or are they symbolic and spiritual? This particular discussion should be seen as a point of interest only, because as Christians we should not derive what we believe from what anyone else believes, but rather from the Word of God. There is no such thing as security in numbers, but only security in Christ and believing His Word. So please bear this in mind as we go through these details. I read the following quote out in part 2, but I'm going to read it again here. Robert Carangola says in his book, The Present Reign of Jesus Christ, concerning Revelation 20 and the millennium as being understood as a literal 1,000 years, the following, quote, "It is imperative that this chapter be prefaced with an awareness of just how foreign this teaching of a literal millennium was, not only to Christ, his apostles and the epistles they produce, but to the vast majority of Christian scholars over the last 15 centuries." End quote. In my study of this matter, I agree that this statement is basically correct. Firstly, as we have already seen, the only place we get a specific mention of 1,000 years is Revelation 20, and it is not mentioned by Jesus Christ nor anyone else, and we don't read of it until we get to Revelation chapter 20. Also, collectively speaking, it was not believed by the vast majority of Christian scholars over the last 15 centuries. And that would be going back to the 4th century AD and not earlier. So please note this as I'm going to come back to this point. On the same page, Robert Carangola gives us a quote from Emma Weston, the wife of the late Charles Gilbert Weston, who gave us the Weston Study Bible, and she said, quote, "The popular millennial teaching is found in some Bible notes and writings of teachers who practice private interpretation, and quote from writings of some early church fathers who believed it. However, this teaching was not part of the belief of the church after AD 431. The Reformers, Luther, Calvin and Knox, and the fathers of the Great Awakening such as Wesley, Whitefield and Finney did not believe in it." End quote. So it is important to understand that the view of a literal 1,000 years was not generally believed until after AD 431, and also the majority of the reformers did not accept such a view. They were basically all amillennial. All of this is true. However, what did those much earlier in the piece believe? Emma Weston has already hinted in her quote that the view was quite different earlier, and this is an interesting point to explore in my opinion. Concerning this, Eliot says, "The doctrine of a first literal resurrection of God's saints was no new doctrine in St. John's time, but one that had passed downward to it from early currency in the Jewish church." And I'm going to make a passing remark here over Eliot's reference to the Jewish church, as this is a common mistake that the majority of people make. It is a misnomer. The early church was not Jewish. The Jews rejected Jesus Christ and the New Covenant. Judaism has no similarity with Christianity. The early church, the church is more correctly Hebrew or Israelitish, but definitely not Jewish. Eliot is saying that early in the piece they did not believe in a figurative spiritual resurrection of God's saints. Those early in the piece were not what became known as amillennial. And also earlier in the same book, Eliot says, "The earliest fathers of the church as Papias, Justin Martyr, Irenaeus, Tertullian, and other fathers, a little later of the 3rd century as Hippolytus, Cyprian, Victorinus, Methodius, Lactantius, and others, explain this resurrection to be literally that of departed martyrs and saints, then at length resuscitated in the body from death and the grave. It's time, agreeably with the order of the vision in the apocalyptic narrative, to synchronize with or follow instantly after the destruction of the beast Antichrist on Christ's personal second advent. The binding of Satan to be an absolute restriction of the powers of hell from tempting, deceiving, or injuring mankind throughout a literal period of 1,000 years thence calculated. The government of the earth, in this its millennial age, to be administered by Christ and his risen saints. So it's quite evident that those earlier in the piece, prior to the Nicene Council of AD 325, were not amillennial. Amillennialism came later, and I'm going to look at this development very shortly. Those earlier in the piece expected the first resurrection to be literal as well as the 1,000 years. Now, again, I remind you that this itself doesn't prove anything. It is a point of interest, but I believe it will become even more interesting as I continue. Then over the next page and the page following, Eliot says, the second chief theory of interpretation, one suggested in the Christian Church ere the end of the 4th century, very much in consequence of the abuse and misapprehension of the literal views just detailed, as if of carnal tendency, and which is best known from its full development by Augustine, may be called the spiritual theory. It supposed the resurrection meant to be that of dead souls from the death of sin to the life of righteousness. That the time of its commencement was to be dated from Christ's first coming and ministry, when the devil, the strong man armed, was, according to Christ's own saying, bound and expelled from the hearts of his disciples, and so there reign over him, though indeed but a regnum militae made to begin. While I have the original Horae Apocalypticae, both the 3rd and the 5th editions, I've never counted the number of footnotes and references, but I understand them to be about 10,000 spread across the 4 volumes. And under the part that we have just read, under footnote 1, we read, already in the 3rd century, Origen and others of his school had controverted the literal millenary view. Epiphanius says, quote, there is indeed a millennium mentioned by St. John, but the majority of pious men look on these words as true indeed, but to be taken in a spiritual sense. End quote. Footnote 2 says, Augustine tells us that he was himself induced by reasons of this kind to abandon the older chiliastic theory and embrace this other. This word chiliastic used here is referring to the millennium. Already in the 3rd century, Origen and others of his school had controverted the literal millenary view. Epiphanius says, quote, there is indeed a millennium mentioned by St. John, but the majority of pious men look on these words as true indeed, but to be taken in a spiritual sense. End quote. Footnote 2. Augustine tells us that he was himself induced by reasons of this kind to abandon the older chiliastic theory and embrace this other. This word chiliastic used here is simply referring to the millennium. Over a couple more pages, Eliot speaks of a 3rd chief theory in relation to interpreting the millennium, and that is called the ecclesiastical theory, which basically thrusts the church itself to the fore of things, and that would be the Roman Catholic Church, so please bear that in mind. It is the church which is the principal object and which is seen triumphing over all of its enemies. And the meaning of this and the explanation of this will become clearer as I progress. But right now I will read what Eliot says. The 3rd chief theory and solution may be called the ecclesiastical theory of the past. I say ecclesiastical as distinguished from Augustine's spiritual, inasmuch as the party triumphing over Satan was in it supposed to be not the mere chosen and faithful in heart individually, but the professing Christian church as a corporate body. There arose a habit very early in the Middle Age of ecclesiasticizing in a manner Augustine's spiritual theory, the apostolic and, as some would say, post-apostolic miracles, the silencing of pagan oracles, and travelling onward of the church to political supremacy over paganism, being appealed to in proof of the visible binding of Satan under the church's power, even from the epoch of its first constitution, and in this more or less ecclesiastical form, Augustine's theory was perpetuated down to the Reformation, indeed yet beyond it, even to the present day. So we can see here that there was a heavy reliance on spiritualizing a lot of things, including miracles, and this kind of thinking continues to this very day, and it comes out of Rome. Eliot continues and says, in order, however, to a presentable ecclesiastical form, the theory needed, of course, some marked commencing epoch of the visible church's visible triumphing over Satan's power, as well as some more consistent solution of the beast as premillennial. Such a commencing epoch presented itself in the Constantinian triumph over paganism early in the 4th century, and in that alone of all the events of past ecclesiastical history. So let's think about what Eliot is saying. In order for this ecclesiastical theory to work, it needed to be able to clearly show that the church had triumphed, was triumphing over the devil, and in this they were able to point to the Constantinian revolution of the 4th century AD, which was the time that the pagan Roman Empire was defeated by Constantine, who made Christianity the state religion. And if you need a refresher on this point in time, please go back to Revelation 6, part 6, which covers this. This event was so significant and dramatic in human history that it presented itself as the point where there began a shift in thinking away from a future first resurrection and future millennium to a present realized spiritual resurrection, as when a person is saved, and a present and realized millennium in which the church was triumphing over all of its enemies, and in point of fact was growing and growing in power. This point is confirmed in the book Chait's History, which there's a quote taken here from the website preteristarchives.org, which says, quote, in the age of Constantine, however, a radical change took place in this belief. After Christianity, contrary to all expectation, triumphed in the Roman Empire and was embraced by the Caesars themselves, the millennial reign, instead of being anxiously waited and prayed for, began to be dated either from the first appearance of Christ or from the conversion of Constantine, and to be regarded as realized in the glory of the dominant imperial state church. End quote. The church historian Eusebius, who lived to see both Diocletian's persecution and Constantine's revolution from paganism to Christianity, said this, but we, freely acknowledging the state of things in our day as better than what we could expect, have been beyond measure astonished at the magnitude of the grace manifested by the author of our mercies. All the race of the enemies of God were destroyed, and were thus suddenly swept away from the sight of men, as the divine word again declares, quote, I saw the wicked lifted up and exalted like the cedars of Lebanon, and I passed by, and lo, he was not, and I sought, and his place was not found. End quote. In the book The Story of Civilization, Part 3, Caesar and Christ, a history of Roman civilization and of Christianity from their beginning to AD 325 by Will Durant, we read this. There is no greater drama in human record than the sight of a few Christians, scorned or oppressed by a succession of emperors, bearing all trials with a fierce tenacity, multiplying quietly, building order while their enemies generated chaos, fighting the sword with the word, brutality with hope, and at last defeating the strongest state that history has known. Caesar and Christ had met in the arena, and Christ had won. In Revelation 12, we also took a look at this Constantinian revolution further when we examined the meaning of the sun-clothed woman, the man-child, and the serpent which was cast out of heaven. And if need be, you could get a quick refresher from Revelation 12, part 3. Once again, there is no doubt at all as to how great this event was in world history. Concerning the destruction of the pagan religion AD 378 to 395, the famous historian Edward Gibbon said in his massive work, The History of the Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire, the ruin of paganism in the age of Theodosius is perhaps the only example of the total extirpation of any ancient and popular superstition, and may therefore deserve to be considered as a singular event in the history of the human mind. Of course, anyone who has been following through this Revelation series will recognize that this great event was also a great step forward for the almost complete corruption of pure Christianity. The Constantinian revolution marked a great falling away and apostasy from true apostolic Christianity towards a paganized form of Christianity mixed with a hierarchical priesthood, and from this came Roman Catholicism, the papacy, who would hold sway over Europe with an iron-fisted grip and who would brutally eliminate all resistance and opposition. The Constantinian revolution did indeed turn the world upside down. However, in terms of true Christianity, while it did end the persecutions of Christians by the Roman Empire, it was not lasting. I have covered this several times throughout this Revelation series, but for some additional insight, you can also check out my part called Daniel's Final Prophecy, Part 4, where the prophecy talks about when they shall fall, that is referring to the Christian martyrs, when they shall fall, they shall be holpen with a little help. This little help that came was the end of Christian martyrdom, and that most certainly was help. But the Christianization of the empire was also the corruption of Christianity, as the record shows, and eventually true Christians were delivered up to even greater persecution. Daniel 11 verse 34, now when they shall fall, they shall be holpen with a little help, but many shall cleave to them with flatteries. And this was the problem with the Christianization of the empire. Suddenly it became popular for the masses to be Christian. And so many came to Christianity as deceivers, wolves in sheep's clothing, having ulterior motives. They confessed Christianity publicly, but they were still pagans privately. They were lovers of prophets, but not lovers of the prophets of God. And so this tremendous event in human history promised much, but was in fact the segue for pagan Rome to become papal Rome. On YouTube, I came across this video by a current Roman Catholic theologian, one Dr. Taylor Marshall, and he confirms what Eliot says insofar as that it was the Roman Catholic Church that developed the amillennial view. In his video, which is relating to Revelation chapter 20, and it's called The Millennium in Catholic Tradition, he clearly states that early in the piece, the view of Revelation 20 was premillennial, and that this was the view held by Irenaeus, Justin Martyr, and others, but this was later corrected, using his words. This was later corrected by those in the Church of Rome which came after these earlier writers. And concerning those who came later, he names St. Augustine of Hippo, Saint Ambrose of Milan, Saint Hippolytus of Rome, Saint Cyprian of Carthage, Saint Athanasius, who happens to be the great defender of Trinitarianism, Saint Cyril of Jerusalem, Saint Basil the Great, Saint Gregory of Nazianzus, Saint Gregory of Nyssa, and also Saint Gregory the Great. Many, but not all, of these are the great Roman Catholic Church players in their own church history, especially after the Council of Nicaea in AD 325, in which council it was formalized and codified what the church would believe, and part of what developed from this was what became known as the amillennial view of Revelation 20, which, as we know, was to spiritualize the whole thing, to make it figurative of a present or realized millennium with a symbolic first resurrection and so on. And the Roman Catholic Church itself was evidence that all of this was true, and there we have it. From this Bible teacher, Daniel Seacombe, and I'm going to add that I don't know anything about this gentleman, but he has written an article called Augustine and the Advent of Amillennialism, and he says this: the Church Father Augustine of Hippo is without a doubt the central figure associated with the eschatological view of amillennialism. His viewpoint became the prevailing doctrine of the Roman Church, and it was adopted with variations by most of the Protestant reformers, along with many other teachings of Augustine. To this day, it has become the basis for amillennialism, which would dominate the Christian Church until well into the modern period. Augustine is considered as the primary Adventist of amillennialism, primarily because there are no acceptable exponents of amillennialism before him. So what we have seen is this. It is clear that those earlier in the piece, early in church history, had a literal view of Revelation 20. Specifically, I mean that they viewed the first resurrection as literal as well as the 1,000 years. These were things yet to come. Then later, as a result of the Constantinian revolution in the 4th century AD, that view changed to amillennialism, wherein the first resurrection was then taught to be spiritual when a person was saved, and the millennium symbolic of a present reality that was seen in the kingdom of God, the gospel of Jesus Christ, now triumphing over paganism, and the whole world at that time becoming Christianized. I'm going to add that it is not a problem or evidence of failure in itself that changes and improvements come in understanding the things concerning the scriptures, especially as this applies to Bible prophecy. If you view my series called An Examination of Preterism and Other Things, there you will see that I look at the development of apocalyptic interpretation, and I show that it took about 1,200 years to pass before it began to dawn on people that the 1,260 days, the 42 months, the times and a half of Bible prophecy were in fact 1,260 literal years. Practically speaking, there was no way that those earlier in the piece could have understood this, especially back in the 1st century AD. Time had to pass. In the case of this prophetic time measurement, a very long period of time had to come to pass before a proper understanding of this and other related aspects of prophecy developed. So please bear that in mind. We need to be balanced. Not all change in the way the scriptures are interpreted is wrong. Of course, sometimes this is detrimental, and on other occasions it draws us closer to the truth, which is what we want. However, what we are seeing here is that the development of the change in the way Revelation 20 was interpreted was directly tied to the Constantinian revolution of the 4th century AD, which propelled the Bishop of Rome and the Church of Rome into front and center of the empire in terms of politics, economics, and the spiritual life of the people and the nation. And while that seemed to be a good thing initially, in fact, it turned out to bring forth much evil. Clearly, in my opinion at least, amillennial teaching reinforces the Church of Rome's claim to be God's kingdom on earth. After all, they rose to the top. They were in charge. The Pope became the kingmaker in Europe, and all of the Western world and even beyond those borders looked to the Bishop of Rome for guidance, support, and blessing. In reality, however, as we saw when we looked at places or chapters like Revelation chapter 12, the dragon, the devil, was wroth with the woman, God's true people, and went to make war with her and the remnant of her seed, which keep the commandments of God and have the testimony of Jesus Christ. A harlot church rose up. This was papal Rome, and in Revelation 12, the true woman, the true Israel of God, fled into the wilderness to hide and to be nourished. She was out of sight, whereas the whore of the book of Revelation, the great mother of harlots, the Church of Rome, was in full view. And the majority of people, even today, still look to the Church of Rome as that great beacon of Christianity down through this dark period in world history. Quite obviously, amillennialism sits very well as Roman Catholic doctrine, as it upholds their view of being the manifestation of God's kingdom on earth down through the last 2,000 years. Accordingly, this understanding is tainted, in my opinion, and should be carefully examined before being accepted. That is my view. I am about to end this part, but before I go, and for the sake of being complete, I will point out that Eliot goes on and also lists a fourth theory propounded in relation to Revelation 20, and he says this: the fourth chief theory of solution is what we may call the ecclesiastical theory of the future. Down to the present has continued to be perhaps the most prevalent and favourite of all the millennial theories, at least among English Protestant expositors. It explains the first resurrection in question to signify a resurrection of the cause, principles, doctrine, spirit, and character too of the Christian martyrs and saints departed, being thus in part spiritual, in part ecclesiastical, and indeed in part too, as I should add, national, inasmuch as it is supposed that the Jews will be then nationally restored, as well as converted, to take a share in it. And if you recall back in the section where I dealt with the meaning of the first and second resurrections, I demonstrated that the idea that the first resurrection signified a resurrection of the cause, principles, doctrine, spirit, and character of the Christian martyrs and saints departed to be an invalid idea, and so I'm not going to comment any further on this fourth theory. And with that, I'll end part 13 here.